Hello and
Hello.
welcome back to the Argyle CISO Leadership Forum. My name is Vicki Limbrunska with Argyle. It's great to have everyone joining us today. Just a couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker for this session. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsor's virtual booth at any time during the event and for the following week. Our partner is permitted to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. And at any time during the event, you can visit their virtual booth from the main agenda page. Also, we want to hear from you. So to ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we'll address your questions at the end of the session. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Phil Wiley, offensive security expert at Horizon 3 AI. We are so excited to have Phil with us for a thought leadership presentation titled Optimal Offensive Security Programs. Welcome, Phil, and over to you.
Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Vicki Lynn, for the warm welcome. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I hope you're enjoying this virtual conference so far. Just a little bit about myself before I get into this presentation, so you can kind of see why you should listen to me. My background is in offensive security, so I've spent a little over the past 12 years on the offensive security side. Got started in information security in January 2004. And one of the things I do is I do a lot of education. It's been more towards people wanting to become pen testers, but I saw the need to teach others in leadership positions and the defender roles about offensive security, because it's one of those areas that not everyone gets the opportunity to work in, but understanding the area more is going to make you a better consumer. You're going to be better at identifying needs and products that can help you out in this area. I'm also the co-author and concept creator of the Pen Tester Blueprint. So I actually wrote a book on this stuff. So we'll kind of get into the presentation. So the agenda, I'm going to do an introduction of offensive security, the types of offensive security approaches, identifying gaps in offensive security programs, strategies for optimizing and overcoming these gaps. So an introduction to offensive security. So offensive security involves assessing the security of targets from a threat actor's perspective. Vulnerabilities that are exploitable by threat actors can be uncovered. And we always hear in the news these breaches, these threat actors, nation states, hackers, gaining access, breaching these environments. So there's no better way to assess the security than to use the same mindset, tools, and techniques that they use. This can include techniques such as hacking, which is the most obvious, social engineering, which is widely used through different types of attacks, including ransomware, and physical breaches. Sometimes people forget about the physical part of this. Sometimes people forget about the fact that you can have the best in class endpoint detection systems and say that you have a organization that is really hard to penetrate, but if someone's able to get access to a keyboard that is locked in or physical access to equipment, then they can more easily gain access. So these are some of the areas that get overlooked a lot. And we're going to discuss that in the gaps during this presentation. And offensive security is an important complement to vulnerability management. It provides a way to validate the effectiveness of the vulnerability management program and ensures critical vulnerabilities are being prioritized and remediated. So offensive security, as we mentioned, is a good complement to vulnerability management. Let's see. So there's the different type of targets that you would see during a pen test, or targets that need to be assessed. And this is really pretty much any kind of technology. There's things on the screen that don't exist yet, or in kind of the thought process. So computers, this could be your laptops, servers, desktops, different types of workstations, your networks and cloud, application, hardware, IoT, your connected devices, IoT, OT, and ICS, AI, physical security, transportation, and people. And so, like as I mentioned, these are some of these. This will grow as time goes on. Just like, for instance, the AI stuff has become more popular. Companies are starting to do bug bounties for AI as well as pen testing AI. So as this evolves, we're going to need to be able to assess the security of those platforms. and to discuss kind of the different types of assessments. So we have your vulnerability management, which is basically vulnerability scanning. So you're performing a vulnerability scan against that environment. You're patching and remediating, and this is kind of a cyclical process. And with vulnerability assessments is the next level. So vulnerability assessment is where you're performing vulnerability scanning, but you also validate the types of so you validate the vulnerabilities that you've discovered. Whereas, vulnerability management, vulnerability scans, sometimes vulnerability scanners will detect false positives. And so this is one of the things, by validating through vulnerability assessments, you're able to rule those out. Vulnerability management is usually quicker to perform because there's really not as much steps involved in that. Vulnerability assessments, you're actually validating the vulnerabilities and also performing further testing with other vulnerability scanners and other tools, some manual testing techniques to make sure that we're not missing anything, that there's no false negatives out there. And then penetration testing is the next step, where you actually do some exploitation, and red teaming and adversary emulation. You're really doing more of emulating a real world threat actor. So vulnerability management is a cyclical practice of identifying, classifying, remediating, mitigating system and software vulnerabilities. Vulnerability management is integral to computer and network security. It must not be confused with vulnerability assessment. So kind of see the phases here. One of the important pieces we have to make sure that we keep in mind is asset discovery and asset inventory are important pieces of vulnerability management. If we don't know about that particular asset, we're not going to know to secure or assess it during penetration tests or during vulnerability scans. So the next step is vulnerability scanning, vulnerability remediation, including patching, and then repeat. This should be something pretty frequently going on in your environment to be able to stay ahead of that. As CVEs come out, we have, CVE or Patch Tuesday when Microsoft releases the patches. So you need to be constantly testing, because the threat actors are looking at these patch releases, reverse engineering the patches, and figuring out how they can still exploit that vulnerability. So we need to make sure that we're staying on top of that. So vulnerability assessments is the next step. And sometimes there's cases where you need a vulnerability assessment over a pen test. And so vulnerability assessments are similar to vulnerability scanning, since it's used to assess the security of the in-scope targets for security flaws. Vulnerability assessments can also be done manually without vulnerability scanners, but it takes more time and is not scalable. A combination of vulnerability scanning and manual testing is most common and more effective and scalable for vulnerability assessments. A major difference between vulnerability assessments and vulnerability scanning is the findings are validated to ensure that there are not false positives, and they can be validated using tools and manual techniques. Some instances, some organizations or consulting companies will run a secondary vulnerability scanner. Something Nessus, Tenable, or Qualys may have not found, maybe another vulnerability scanner will find. I've had cases where I was performing pen tests and I was using Tenable's Nessus for my scanner, and the customer was using Nexpose, and I found things that they didn't find. And that could be the reverse. Sometimes different vendors come out with these CVEs in their product sooner, and so it's just a matter of who comes out with it first. So running a secondary scanner is one of these ways that can be detected. And some of the cases where you'd want to do a vulnerability assessment is maybe if you're looking at some really delicate infrastructure within your environment. Say you have some mainframes, some different legacy computing systems, you really want to be careful during your testing. So it may require a vulnerability assessment. One time on an engagement, I was performing a Wi-Fi pen test for a small hospital chain. And as I noticed and I got on the network, started scanning, doing some discovery scans, I saw medical devices connected to the hospital ER Wi-Fi. And so they really didn't feel comfortable trying to hack these systems. So I went back to the CISO. We kind of come up with this plan. Here's what we'll do is we'll do a vulnerability assessment. We'll discover the items in scope, and then we'll perform a a security control review over the wireless controllers and access points to check for any kind of vulnerabilities there without harming any of the equipment that being used in these ORs and emergency rooms. So penetration tests, this is or pen test for short, is similar to vulnerability assessments used to assess the security of the computers, networks, targets, whatever technology that you're testing for security flaws. And we're testing for exploitable vulnerabilities. So during the vulnerability assessment, some of the things we can do is research to see if those particular vulnerabilities, if they're exploitable. And we can document those because we're not actually going to test those. But one of the things also too with the pen test doing the exploitation piece, you're able to see if they're actually truly exploitable. So you can run a vulnerability scan. There could be mitigating controls in place that are preventing that system from being exploited. Maybe there's firewall rules in place, host-based firewalls in place, preventing the attack or other mitigating controls. And then we do see some of these vulnerabilities that come out that are listed as critical, but it takes a chain of misconfigurations for those to happen. So doing a vulnerability or doing exploitation during the penetration test, you're able to find out whether they're truly exploitable or not. Once we see if we can exploit those items, we're going to see if we could take it a step further and do post exploitation. So, are we able to do lateral movement? We're able to gain control of other systems within that environment, gain access to data. Sometimes some of these breaches that we see are really not that complex of a hack or breach. It's some case where shared files were not properly secured, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. We see a lot of cases where S3 buckets are insecure. People are sharing insecurely information and code on GitHub, where maybe it's open to the public and someone's able to get in and see hard-coded credentials. And then we're also seeing if we can elevate privileges. Can we elevate privileges to domain administrator, enterprise admin, or root if it's on a Linux or Unix system? But kind of to go back to that, our crown jewels is our data. So you want to make sure to try to access any kind of data. Some other steps you can attempt to do, and this is really more common on red team operations, is testing data exfiltration. So when you're testing data exfiltration, you'll want to use data that's mocked up to look like legit data. Something that looks like credit card numbers or PII, but we don't want to use actual PII. Because if we do that, then this is an incident. So we want to make sure that we avoid that, but it's a good way to test. And so there's different types of testing. And so one of the more common approaches we see is black box, aka blind pen test. So this is little to no details on the target and scope, more of a threat actor or malicious hacker approach. And this is commonly, this is going to be the way a threat actor nation state is going to try to exploit your assets in your environment. So this is one thing. This is a good way to test, but it's not the only way to test. So gray box is the next level. This is more detailed information. This is what you're going to see. You've got a defined scope. You've got IP addresses, subnets, domain names in scope. So that way everything's thoroughly tested. With the black box approach, items could get missed if it's not detected during the reconnaissance phase. And then we get to the white box approach, which is also known as the crystal box or assumed breach. This type of testing method has been very common in applications for years because we want to test at different levels of access. So a customer using a banking application doesn't need to be able to see the same items and data as someone that works in a bank branch or an administrator of the overall application. So performing authenticated testing, we're able to go in and see, are they able to elevate privileges? Are they able to access resources that they should not be able to access? So you test for that. Then also you're testing source code. So one of the things we need to do is make sure that our source code is tested and secure. So we perform static code analysis against that code. So that way we're doing a more layered approach to it, not just testing dynamically. We're testing whether the code is not secure or not. And so where this white box or assumed breach has become popular, assumed breaches really came about from pen test companies going into test organizations. As our endpoints get more uh, hardened and more difficult to exploit, there are cases where pen testers would go in, test the environment, and if they couldn't get a foothold, pen test was written up, delivered to the customer, and what seemed like a really secure environment, but it didn't take in consideration people that have authorized access. This could be nation states infiltrating an organization. This could be disgruntled employees. This could be someone finding credentials. Maybe someone had written down credentials on a piece of paper. Someone found that in the recycle or trash dumpsters, or maybe the data was leaked. Maybe the passwords were password reuse case where maybe the employee was part of their credentials was a part of data breach and passwords are reused. So we need to go in and see what happens if the user's authenticated and have access to the network. That way you can thoroughly test your environment to make sure that it's not exploitable. And so this is a very important testing method to do. Some of the hardcore purist hackers will say that's not a fair test or a good type of test, but really you want to test more thoroughly. You don't want to depend on a black box, a gray box pen test. You can take a combination approach. So if you're testing an application or before you do an assumed breach test within an organization, try the black box approach, see if you can get a foothold to identify any of those exploitable vulnerabilities, and then move on to doing the assumed breach. And so red teaming. So there's a lot of confusion around red teaming, and this is really kind of a lot of why I created this presentation, which is a combination of a presentation I did at Black Hat Middle East and Africa last year with some new items, adding in the gaps and how to remediate those gaps. So red teaming is the process of using tactics, techniques, and procedures to emulate real-world threat actors with the goal of training and measuring the effectiveness of people, process, technology used to defend the environment. So with red teaming, we're not just testing the technology to see if it's vulnerable, and then even past it, like you're doing a social engineering engagement, you're going past just testing the people's reaction time. We're also testing the process. Are people following the incident response plan? This is very important. One of the best outcomes I've seen of a red team exercise kind of goes this, but to add a little something before that, with a pen test, everyone with the organization, especially IT and cybersecurity, the different security teams know about the pen test. But with a red team operation, you're testing the response time and you're also testing the people. There's only a control group. So maybe the CISO and some other senior management may know about this operation. So that way, if it's reported, then the security teams can be told, yeah, this is planned, to let them know it's not a real incident. So one of the cases that I saw was one of the best responses as a CISO or an executive you want to see during a red team operation was this company was having this red team op performed, and one of the people from the defensive side had called up the CISO and said, yeah, we've got the incident response team on site. They had a retainer with an organization that did their incident response. And so they reported it. And so this CISO was able to say, yeah, this was a planned exercise. So this was a good result of how people with an organization responded. They followed the incident response plan, which was part of that was to contact the consulting company that did their incident response so they could come in and try to stop the breach, come in and look for any kind of incidents of compromise, get it under control, find root cause of the event, and maintain and retain that. So investigate in the full 9 yards. So this red teaming is also known as adversary emulation. Now you'll run into different people within the organization, within the industry. They could be vendors, they could be consulting companies, because the term red teaming has been so synonymous with pen testing. There's a lot of confusion. So it's one of these things to know when you're requesting a type of assessment to keep this in mind, that you're actually you know, making sure you're on the same page, making sure you're requesting the type of assessment you want. That way you're getting the results and the type of assessment you need. And so here's a comparison. This was kind of from the organization I worked at once, where there was a lot of misunderstanding about how these different type of assessments work, and you can see the comparison. So vulnerability management is listed as not an assessment type. It's an important piece of your vulnerability management program and offensive security program. You should include this, but just showing the differences there. So you're doing asset discovery and inventory, vulnerability scanning, and validating the vulnerabilities. So also this goes back to remediating, patching, and reoccurring this cycle. So vulnerability assessment is you're basically doing validation uh, while you're doing the testing, some manual testing to find things that you might not have discovered otherwise. And also with penetration testing is reconnaissance, vulnerability scanning, vulnerability validation, exploitation, manual testing, and post exploitation. And then with the red teaming, you're going to be a little more quiet with your reconnaissance, your vulnerability discovery. You can't use some of the vulnerability scanners because you're trying to go undetected. So identifying the gaps in offensive security programs. So kind of an offensive security lesson or history lesson here. At one time, pen tests were full scope, meaning uh, social engineering, physical pen testing, all these different methods were included. But then with the rise of PCI brought more awareness. But what happened is these pen tests were more limited in scope. Some areas that weren't even they're not part of PCI aren't tested. And we have PII, we have different information in other areas that are not in scope for PCI, but if we're only testing for compliance, we're really missing out. So identifying gaps in offensive security programs. So there's assessment frequency. So pen test or security posture snapshot, and commonly referred to as a time box test. So you're only as secure as you are at that moment. CVEs are continually being released. Pen testing once a year is really not enough. Time between tests are opportunities for threat actors. So overlooked methods, so like physical security controls, social engineering, red teaming, assume breach, and purple teaming, aka controls validation. These are some areas that are being missed. And then also some of the environments that are being missed is wireless networks. Wireless networks are a way for a threat actor to gain access to your environment, although they have to be within a mile or so to be able to hack you wirelessly. But these are risks as well as cloud. A lot of cases we've heard, cloud is secure. A lot of companies move to it because they can offload some of their management to their infrastructure. And some folks were led to believe it's going to be a lot more secure. There's still vulnerabilities there. IoT devices, including cameras, they need to be addressed. A lot of threat actors are able to gain access through these IP connected cameras. So strategies for overcoming gaps in offensive security. So pen test frequency. So increase this by frequency. I would say a continuous method of pen testing, or at least more frequency. Once a year is really not enough. I would say I would actually recommend more than quarterly. Implement automation to improve scalability and frequency. That's one of the things that we offer through our platform. We're able to automate and scale your team. Implement bug bounties and responsible disclosure programs for mobile apps, external web applications, and APIs. So that way you're getting a little more coverage on those and a little more frequency. Someone's constantly testing those environments. And so overlook methods. So implement the following methods: social engineering, including phishing campaigns. And this is more past your canned email campaigns where you send out these phishing emails and someone clicks, you're counting clicks. You really need to be testing with a payload. What happens if someone clicks on malware? What's possible past that? It's a way to really test how resilient you are against ransomware. So physical security control assessments, these are important. As I mentioned earlier, people gain access to these systems. They have a lot better opportunity of breaching those systems. And red teaming, adversary emulation. So this is something to provide periodically. A pen test finds all the vulnerabilities. that are exploitable, and red teaming emulates real world types of breaches. And so, as we mentioned, these environments need to be tested, and we'll go to the Q&A. So, have some questions here. Like most security teams, we conduct a myriad of offensive security tests, aka gap analysis. Where have you seen companies fail most often, and what are the most common weakest links? So I'm going to say one of the things I see is missing types of testing. So not performing physical testing, not performing social engineering. As mentioned earlier, when you're doing your phishing campaigns, you want to use like payloads within your phishing campaigns to see what's possible if someone clicks on a payload. So making sure that you're doing this more frequently, that you're frequently testing, because I have an example where I tested a company where they had a 90-day retest. I went in, they did a good job of remediating the criticals, highs, and mediums, but within that 90 days, when I came back to retest one of those lows, a security researcher had figured out how to exploit it. Not that it was exploited, but when I came back running my initial vulnerability scans, now it was a higher critical. If they hadn't brought us in for a retest, they would have laid vulnerable for over a year. And question number 2, what are some of the best practices you've seen in terms of measuring the success of a offensive security program? So one of the things I've seen is where people are through this is being able to reduce your threats, being able to do this on a frequent basis. I think one of the things too is to educate your internal staff so that way they understand the importance of this. So just from what I've seen, people that take remediation seriously, make sure that they keep up on having these reoccurring tests. That's the way they do it. It needs to be part of everything you do, even part of your software development life cycle. It needs to be built into the culture. So one of the questions was, do you have any recommendations for addressing skills gaps and developing training plans? So yes, with the addressing skills gaps, one of the best resources out there is Hack the Box. They have Hack the Box Academy, and you can go in and practice on those different tests. And one of my friends from the cybersecurity community works for an airlines, and when he was the red team lead there, on Fridays they took a couple hours in the afternoon after lunch to work on Hack the Box as a team, kind of like in a CTF environment. But Hack the Box Academy has added IoT training, red team training, cloud. So they offer a lot of really good training. So it's kind of a good way for people to go in and work at their own pace. So they have content that's suitable for someone that's just starting out all the way up to very senior individuals. So that concludes the questions. So back to you, Vicki Lynn.
Thank you so much, Phil. What an incredible thought leadership presentation. We appreciate you being here. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. And for those of you who did earn points throughout today's event, an Argyle team member will follow up with the winners in the next couple of weeks for those prizes. This officially does conclude the Argyle CISO Leadership Forum, Cloud Security and Governance. Thank you again for joining us today and engaging in our content. We look forward to seeing you at our next Argyle Digital Information Technology event, which will be our CIO Leadership Forum on September 24th, 2024. Go to argyleforum.com and you can find out more about all of our programs. Thank you again, Phil, and thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.